All right, so are you ready to dig into some really interesting legal stuff with me today?
Always.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Because we're going deep on a concurring opinion.
Ooh, fun.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Chief Justice Roberts in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health,
Okay.
the case that overturned Roe v. Wade.
Right.
And, a concurring opinion means a judge agrees with the outcome,
Huh.
but they get there a different way.
Yeah, different path.
And those different paths can be really revealing.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially in a landmark decision like this.
Absolutely. Those alternative routes can reveal just as much
Right.
about legal interpretation as, like, the main road.
Yeah. And in this case, Roberts' concurring opinion offers some really intriguing insights into how he views the role of the court
Yes.
and the complexities of overturning these precedents that have been around for a long time.
Exactly. And so in Dobbs, Roberts agreed that Roe's viability standard,
Yeah.
that's the idea that states can't ban abortion before a fetus can survive outside the womb, had to go. Okay.
But he didn't want to completely overturn the right to abortion.
Right.
Which is what the majority opinion ultimately did.
Yeah. And that's where things get
Yeah,
fascinating.
it is.
Roberts didn't just disagree with how broadly the majority applied the ruling.
Right.
He fundamentally disagreed with the logic
Yes.
behind the viability line itself.
Yeah.
He calls it arbitrary and unreasoned,
Wow.
even pointing out that the arguments in Roe and Casey
Okay.
for establishing viability as the dividing line
Right.
were practically non-existent.
So he's basically saying the Roe court just pulled this viability line out of thin air.
Pretty much, yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty bold statement, even for a Supreme Court justice.
It is, and to further emphasize his point, Roberts compares the U.S. approach to abortion law
Okay.
with other countries.
Interesting.
He highlights that most countries have a 12-week cutoff
Okay.
for elective abortions,
Okay.
only a handful.
Uh-huh.
And he very pointedly mentions China and North Korea here allow elective abortions past 20 weeks.
Okay, that's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah.
It definitely makes you question whether the viability line
Yeah.
was ever grounded in any kind of globally recognized standard.
Right.
But if Roberts was so against the viability rule, what was he proposing instead?
Yes.
Did he have an alternative in mind?
He did. Roberts argued for a much narrower decision,
Okay.
one that focused solely on getting rid of the viability rule
Right.
without completely tossing out the right to abortion altogether.
Okay.
He suggested that the right to choose
Right.
doesn't necessarily have to extend all the way to viability,
Okay.
as long as women have a reasonable opportunity.
A reasonable opportunity. That's an interesting phrase.
Yeah.
It feels a little open to interpretation, right?
It does, yeah.
I mean, what exactly constitutes a reasonable opportunity in Roberts' view?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Roberts argued that a 15-week ban, like the one Mississippi was trying to implement
Uh-huh.
in the Dobbs case,
Right.
would actually provide a reasonable opportunity for a woman to choose.
Okay.
And he had some specific reasons for thinking this.
Okay.
He pointed out that pregnancy tests these days are super accurate
Makes sense.
and readily available.
Yeah,
So women know they're pregnant much earlier than in the past.
that's true. No more waiting months for a doctor to confirm a pregnancy.
Exactly. Plus, he brought up the increased availability of abortion medication,
Uh-huh.
which is most effective in those early stages of pregnancy.
Right.
And he also highlighted the fact that, statistically speaking,
Yeah.
the vast majority of abortions already happen in the first trimester.
So his argument is that a 15-week ban wouldn't actually impact
Right.
most women seeking abortions.
Yeah.
And it would still give them time to make a choice.
Uh-huh.
It's definitely a different approach, kind of a middle ground
Right.
between the pre-dog situation and a total ban.
Right.
But I'm guessing this wouldn't sit well with people who support a broader right to abortion access.
You're right. And this is where Roberts' views on stare decisis,
Yeah.
the principle of upholding precedent, come into play.
Okay.
Because while he believed Roe's viability standard was wrong,
Right.
he actually disagreed with the majority's decision to completely overturn Roe and Casey.
Hold on.
Yeah.
So even though he thought Roe was wrongly decided,
Uh-huh.
he still didn't want to completely overturn it.
Yep.
That seems a little, I don't know, contradictory.
It might seem that way,
Yeah.
but it really boils down to Roberts' strong belief in judicial restraint.
Okay.
He's very cautious about the court making sweeping changes,
Yeah.
unless they're absolutely necessary.
Right.
He argues that overturning Roe completely would have been like ripping off a Band-Aid
Ooh, yeah.
that had been there for decades,
Yeah.
creating chaos and uncertainty.
Whereas tweaking the viability line would have been more like slowly and carefully peeling it off?
Precisely.
Okay.
Roberts believed the court should avoid rocking the boat
Yeah.
whenever possible. And in his view,
Right.
they should have just addressed the specific question of the viability rule in Dobbs,
Okay.
leaving the broader question of the right to abortion for another day.
Interesting.
Maybe when the facts on the ground had shifted even more.
It's almost like he's saying, let's fix the obvious flaw, but let's not go throwing the baby out with the bathwater just yet.
Yeah.
It's a very incremental approach, which, let's be honest, isn't exactly what we're used to seeing from the Supreme Court, especially on such a hot-button issue.
That's what makes his opinion so thought-provoking, I think.
Yeah.
It raises a lot of questions about how judges balance upholding existing precedents with addressing evolving social contexts.
Okay, so we've unpacked Roberts' critique of the viability line, his alternative approach of upholding a 15-week ban, and this fascinating tension he highlights between precedent and societal change.
Right.
But there's still more to explore.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like how he squares his stance with those who believe in a more expansive right to choose.
Absolutely. And we also need to dive into how Roberts directly challenges the majority's reasoning for overturning Roe completely.
Yeah.
Because he had some strong opinions about that.
All right, let's get into all of that.
Yeah.
Because I'm definitely ready to hear more.
Right.
But first, a quick message from our sponsors.
Okay.
So before the break, we were talking about Chief Justice Roberts.
Yeah.
And his more measured approach to Dobbs, his belief that the court shouldn't have completely overturned Roe.
Yes, and it's important to remember what the majority's argument for a full overturn was.
Right.
They claimed that Roe was not only decided incorrectly, but it had also caused significant damage to the country's legal and political landscape.
They said Roe created all this confusion in the courts because of conflicting precedents and basically turned abortion into this never-ending political football.
Exactly. And this is a key point where Roberts pushes back against the majority opinion.
Okay.
He argues that overturning Roe in its entirety would actually create far more legal chaos than simply adjusting the viability line.
Okay, so I'm trying to picture this.
Yeah.
So if the court had only addressed the viability issue, states would still have to operate under the precedent that there is a constitutional right to abortion.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't automatically extend to the point of viability?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
States couldn't just implement outright bans on all abortions. They'd have to work within the existing framework of the abortion.
Right.
Which Roberts believed would lead to more legal clarity, not less.
Interesting. So instead of this sudden and drastic shift in the legal landscape, Roberts is envisioning a more gradual and measured evolution of abortion law.
Exactly.
How do you think that would play out in practice?
Well, Roberts argued that a narrower approach would give lower courts a much clearer set of guidelines to work with.
Okay.
It would essentially force states to be more thoughtful and nuanced in how they crafted abortion laws. It wouldn't be this legal free-for-all that the majority seemed to be worried about.
I'm starting to see how his reasoning lines up with his views on stare decisis and judicial restraint. He's basically saying, let's respect the existing precedent while also acknowledging that it needs some adjustments.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the different philosophies at play within the court.
It also makes his critique of the majority's Brown v. Board of Education comparison even more interesting.
You're picking up on a subtle but important point there.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Roberts pushed back against the majority's claim that overturning Roe was comparable to overturning Plessy v. Ferguson, which upheld segregation. He seemed to imply that while both Roe and Plessy were wrongly decided, they don't carry the same moral weight.
So overturning Roe wouldn't be this grand act of righting a historical wrong, like Brown v. Board was. It would be more about refining a legal framework that, while flawed, had been in place for decades.
Exactly. And that's where his concern about societal reliance comes in. He recognized that Roe had been deeply ingrained in American society. And he worried about the ripple effects of suddenly overturning it.
People have built their lives around the right to abortion as it existed under Roe. It makes sense that abruptly changing the rules of the game would have a huge impact on everything.
Yeah.
From family planning to healthcare access to women's economic opportunities.
Right. Roberts seemed acutely aware of those potential consequences.
Yeah.
And he argued that a narrower ruling, focusing just on the viability line, would be less disruptive to people's lives.
Okay.
It all goes back to his belief in a more incremental approach.
Right.
Which is a significant contrast to the majority's view.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Roberts' critique of the viability line, his proposed alternative of upholding a 15-week ban, his arguments about stare decisis, judicial restraint, and societal reliance.
Right.
But there's one piece that we haven't fully explored yet.
You're talking about Roberts' emphasis on the right to choose.
Yes.
He argued that this right doesn't inherently require extending to viability, as long as women have a reasonable opportunity.
Right. And that feels like a crucial point.
It is.
Because it raises so many questions, like who gets to decide what's reasonable?
Yeah.
And how might this emphasis on the right to choose shape future legal challenges to abortion restrictions?
Yeah.
Will we see more arguments focused on the opportunity to choose rather than specific gestational limits?
Those are great questions. And unfortunately, Roberts' concurring opinion doesn't provide definitive answers. But his emphasis on the right to choose does offer a potential roadmap for future legal arguments about abortion.
A roadmap that could lead to even more debate, I imagine.
I think so.
Especially as states try to navigate this new legal landscape post-Dobbs.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the political and social context surrounding all of this. The issue of abortion is incredibly polarizing.
Yes.
And it will likely remain a point of contention for years to come.
It's a lot to unpack, and I'm really curious to hear your perspective on how Roberts' opinion might influence these ongoing debates. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is, that Roberts' opinion, even though it didn't carry the day in Dobbs, it could still have a lasting impact on how abortion laws are argued and decided in the future.
That's really interesting. Are you saying his approach might actually gain traction as the dust settles from the Dobbs ruling?
It's certainly possible. His focus on the right to choose and this idea of a reasonable opportunity to choose could resonate with judges who are looking for a middle ground in this highly polarized debate.
So instead of focusing on hard and fast gestational limits like the viability standard, we might see more arguments based on whether a particular law gives women enough of an opportunity to make a decision about their pregnancies.
And that shift in focus could have major implications for how abortion laws are challenged and defended. It opens up a whole new set of questions that courts will have to grapple with. Like, what factors should be considered when determining whether an opportunity is reasonable? And how much deference should be given to state legislatures in making those determinations.
It feels like we're moving into even murkier legal waters. I mean, the viability standard, while controversial, was at least relatively clear-cut. But this reasonable opportunity standard seems much more subjective and open to interpretation.
You're absolutely right. It's a much more nuanced and complex standard. And it will likely lead to a lot of litigation as courts try to figure out how to apply it in practice.
It makes you wonder if Roberts, in his desire for a more measured and incremental approach, might have inadvertently opened the door to even more legal uncertainty and debate down the road.
That's a valid point. And it highlights the inherent tension in Roberts' approach. He wants the court to act with restraint. To avoid these sweeping pronouncements that could disrupt settled expectations. But sometimes those incremental changes can create just as much uncertainty, especially when they introduce new and untested legal concepts.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Roberts' concurring opinion, what are the key takeaways do you think our listeners should really hold on to?
First, I think it's important to remember that even on a seemingly settled issue, like the overturning of Roe, there can be profoundly different viewpoints within the court itself.
For sure.
Roberts' opinion reminds us that legal reasoning is rarely black and white. And that even in landmark rulings, there are often alternative paths and nuanced perspectives.
It's like that saying, there are two sides to every story. In this case, there were at least two sides within the court itself.
Exactly. And second, I think Roberts' opinion highlights the challenges of navigating legal precedent in a rapidly changing social and political landscape.
Yeah.
He's wrestling with how to uphold the principles of stare decisis and judicial restraint, while also recognizing the need to adapt to evolving societal understandings.
It feels like he's walking a tightrope, trying to balance respect for the past with acknowledgement of the present, and it's a balancing act that courts will likely continue to grapple with, not just on abortion, but on a whole range of issues.
You're right, and that's why even though Roberts' view didn't prevail in Dobbs, his concurring opinion is still incredibly relevant. It provides a window into how some judges are thinking about these complex issues. And it offers potential avenues for legal arguments moving forward.
So it's not just a historical document, it's a living document in a way. It's still shaping the conversation about abortion rights even after the Dobbs ruling.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that legal debates don't end. With a single court decision, they continue to evolve.
Yes.
And Roberts' opinion will undoubtedly be part of those ongoing conversations.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I feel like I understand the Dobbs decision.
Good.
And the broader debate about abortion rights.
Yeah.
On a much deeper level now, what do you think, listener? Did you glean anything new or surprising from our exploration of Chief Justice Roberts' concurring opinion? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring these issues. Read the opinions, engage in thoughtful discussions, and stay informed as this debate unfolds.
Because these are conversations that affect all of us, and it's important to be engaged and informed. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time.